Welcome to the J-Spot Saturday Deep Dive, the place where we stimulate the most sensitive parts of your brain on your favorite day of the week.
Thank you so much for having me. I have to say, just looking at the calendar today, we have landed on a very, very specific and resonant moment in time for this conversation.
We really, really have. If you are listening to this on the day it drops, it is Saturday, February 28, 2026.
Right, the absolute final day of Black History Month.
Yeah, and tomorrow is Sunday, March 1st.
The kickoff of Women's History Month.
Exactly. And I've been thinking about that transition literally all week. Because, we have this tendency to compartmentalize history, right? We put it in these neat little boxes. We say, okay, for 28 days, the curriculum is Black history.
Right. And then the clock strikes midnight and we swap out the banners in the library.
Yeah.
And suddenly we are doing women's history. As if those two things operate in completely different universes.
Yeah.
As if they never touch.
Yeah, exactly. It feels administrative. But lived experience isn't administrative at all. It's messy. It's overlapping. The timeline doesn't just reset because the month changed on the calendar.
No, it doesn't.
So the mission for our deep dive today is to really reject that separation. We want to create a flagship discussion that actually bridges these 2 months.
I love that.
Because we aren't just looking back at the history we have just covered. We are looking inward at the psychology of oppression, and then we are looking outward at the specific people, specifically the Black women who built the actual bridges between the civil rights movement and the labor and feminist movements.
It's a moment of transition. And historically, transitions are where the friction happens. And that friction creates heat, and that heat creates light.
That is beautifully put.
We are going to be moving from the very high-level sociology of the late 19th century right into the gritty legal theories of the late 20th century.
And speaking of people who have to manage transitions and juggle multiple identities all the time, I want to take just a quick second to appreciate our listeners.
Absolutely.
Because we know we have a lot of learners out there, people who are balancing life and work and education and family.
And people who are tired but still curious.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I want to send a special shout out down to Puerto Rico to Jessie Villalfalba. We see you, Jessie. We see you being an example as a hardworking mom and a wife, all while holding that college degree.
That is not easy at all.
No, it requires a very specific kind of mental tenacity, an ability to code switch between roles like mother and professional and scholar. Yeah. And that actually ties directly into what we are unpacking today.
It really does.
Yeah.
That ability to hold multiple selves is the core theme of this entire hour.
So let's lay out the map for everyone. We are starting with a birthday. W.E.B. Du Bois was born on February 23rd, so we are still officially in his birthday week.
Happy birthday to a giant.
Truly. And we are going to unpack his concept of double consciousness. And I don't mean just the standard textbook definition. I want us to understand the deep psychological toll it takes.
Right. We are going to look at how that concept applies to modern mental health. We will get into the idea of second sight and, of course, the veil.
And then we are going to walk across that bridge into March. We are going to look at intersectionality, which is a word that gets misused constantly these days.
Oh, absolutely it does.
We will see how Black women, who are often completely marginalized by both Black men in the civil rights fight and white women in the feminist fight, became the actual bridge leaders of American democracy.
It is quite a dense stack of sources today.
Yeah.
We have Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. We have legal reviews from Kimberly Crenshaw. And we have psychological studies on racial trauma.
So let's dive right in. Part 1. The sociological genius of W.E.B. Du Bois.
A giant. There is really no other word for him. William Edward Burgard Du Bois, born February 23, 1868.
1868. Okay, so let's contextualize that for a second. The Civil War has just ended.
Yeah.
The 13th Amendment is ratified. We are in the very early, hopeful but chaotic days of Reconstruction.
Right. But he isn't born in the Deep South. That's a key detail. He is born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, a relatively integrated, quiet community.
So not born into slavery.
Exactly. He is born into a world where he, theoretically, at least has a chance. And he takes that chance and just runs with it.
Runs with it is an understatement. I mean, the man's academic resume is intimidating, even by 2026 standards.
It is wild. He becomes the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University in 1895. He studies at Fisk. He studies at the University of Berlin. He is arguably one of the most educated men in the entire Western Hemisphere at that time, regardless of race.
But here's the thing that really struck me in the research materials. When he started out, Du Bois wasn't a radical. He wasn't a protester. He was kind of a nerd.
Oh, he was a total social scientist. He was deeply, deeply entrenched in the ivory tower. You have to remember the mindset of the late 19th century. There was this profound belief in the Enlightenment, that science and reason were the ultimate tools to fix society.
Right.
Du Bois believed that the Negro problem, as they called it back then, was essentially just a giant misunderstanding.
Wait, he thought it was just a data problem.
Essentially, yes. He really thought that racism was caused by pure ignorance. He believed that if he could just gather enough empirical data, if he could make enough charts and graphs showing that black people were human and moral and capable.
And then just present that data to white America.
Yes. He thought they would look at the math and say, oh, we didn't know. Thank you for showing us the truth. And then they would rationally correct the inequality.
That seems incredibly naive for a guy with a Harvard PhD. I mean, did he really think a pie chart would end lynching?
It seems naive to us now looking back through the lens of history, sure. But at the time, sociology was a brand new field. He was pioneering the very idea that you could use data to solve social ills. He spent years writing the Philadelphia Negro, going door to door, collecting thousands and thousands of surveys.
Just trying to prove black humanity through math.
Exactly.
So when does the shift happen then? When does he realize that the math just isn't working?
Well, it was a gradual disillusionment. But he actually realized that truth alone doesn't set you free if the people holding the keys refuse to even read the truth.
Right.
He realized that racism wasn't about ignorance at all. It was about power. It was structural, and it was deeply psychological. So he left the ivory tower. He decided he had to become, in his own words, a full-time agitator.
I love that pivot. It's like, okay, I tried the nice way. I tried the spreadsheets. Now I am bringing the noise.
And that noise put him on a direct collision course with the other absolute titan of that era, Booker T. Washington.
The great debate. We definitely have to talk about this because I feel like history often oversimplifies this into Du Bois was right and Washington was wrong. But in 1895, Washington was the man.
Booker T. Washington was the most powerful black man in America, bar none. He controlled the patronage. He had the ear of presidents and wealthy philanthropists. And his philosophy, the Atlantic Compromise, was incredibly appealing to a lot of people for a very pragmatic reason.
Survival.
Survival.
Yeah, because his argument was cast down your bucket where you are.
Right. He was telling black people in the South specifically, do not agitate for civil rights. Do not try to vote. Do not try to force social integration. That will get you killed.
Which was a very real threat.
A daily reality. Instead, he said, focus on industrial education. Learn to be a bricklayer or a carpenter or a farmer. Make yourself economically indispensable to the white South. He believed that if you have money and a trade, eventually respect and rights will follow naturally.
And to be fair, if I am living in Alabama in 1895 and I see people getting lynched for looking at a white person the wrong way, Washington's advice sounds a lot like a very smart survival strategy.
It was absolutely a survival strategy. It was gradualism. But Du Bois looked at that exact same situation and he saw a trap.
What was the flaw in Washington's plan, according to the sources?
Well, Du Bois argued that you simply cannot protect your economic gains if you don't have political power.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. Think about it. If you build a highly successful farm but you can't vote and you have no legal standing, the white sheriff can just come and take your farm.
Which happened all the time.
Exactly. If you don't have civil rights, you have absolutely no mechanism to defend your property.
So economic power without political power is really just a temporary lease.
That is a great way to put it. And furthermore, Du Bois violently attacked the idea of limiting education to just trade schools. He asked the question, who is going to teach the teachers? Who is going to be the doctors? Who is going to argue the law in court?
And this is where he introduces the concept of the talented 10th.
Yes.
Which sounds a bit elitist to a modern ear, doesn't it? The idea that the top 10% of black people are the ones who have to lead.
It is elitist, and he was heavily criticized for that both then and now. But his point was that a race needs its own leadership class. You need that top 10% to have the classical education, philosophy and history and literature, so they can guide the masses and fight for the race on the intellectual stage.
Yeah.
You can't just have a nation of bricklayers and expect to win a political war.
That makes sense. And Du Bois didn't just debate this in parlors. He took the fight directly to the press. He became the editor of The Crisis, which was the NAACP magazine. And we have some excerpts here in the sources. And he wasn't writing academic papers anymore.
No. Definitely not. The Crisis was his megaphone. He used it to assault every racial taboo. There's a report in our sources about a lynching in Coatesville, Pennsylvania.
Wait, Pennsylvania. So this isn't the Deep South. This is the North.
Exactly. And Du Bois writes about it with this visceral, almost gothic horror. He writes the flames beat and curled against the moonlit sky.
Wow.
He describes the smell of it. He describes the crowd watching. He wanted the white readers in the North, who comfortably thought racism was just a Southern problem, to feel the literal heat of that fire.
He was using language to force them to look at the brutality they desperately wanted to ignore.
Yes.
And that idea of forcing people to look, or rather the way people look at each other, is a perfect segue to his most famous concept. Which brings us to section 2, Unpacking Double Consciousness.
This comes from his 1903 masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk.
Now, you mentioned earlier when we were prepping that Du Bois didn't actually invent this term.
No, he didn't. Double consciousness was actually a term used in the 19th century by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
The transcendentalist guy.
Exactly. He used it to describe the split between the spiritual world and the material world, but it was also a medical term.
Medical, like a psychological diagnosis?
Yes. In the 1890s, psychologists used double consciousness to describe actual cases of split personality. There was a very famous case study of a woman named Mary Reynolds who would basically flip between two completely different personalities.
Okay.
So when Du Bois uses this phrase in 1903, his readers would have immediately heard it as a clinical medical or deep philosophical term.
But Du Bois remixes it. He takes a medical term and applies it to sociology.
He applies it to the condition of an entire race. He argues that the black experience in America causes a psychological split that is functionally similar to that medical diagnosis.
I want to read the quote from the source material because it is arguably one of the most famous passages in American sociology, and I think we need to really sit with it for a second.
Please do.
He writes, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity."
Measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. That is just devastating.
It really is. Break that down for me, though. What exactly is the tape in this metaphor?
The tape is the measuring stick, the standard of value. Du Bois is saying that a black person in America doesn't just have the luxury of their own internal sense of self-worth.
Right.
They're constantly heavily forced to evaluate themselves using the white world standards. And the white world standard says, you are less than, you are a problem, you are pitiable.
So you constantly have two voices in your head.
Yes. He calls it two-ness. He writes, one ever feels his two-ness, an American and Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body.
Two warring ideals. That heavily implies that you simply can't be both at the same time?
Not in 1903 America, you couldn't. Think about the definitions.
Yeah.
To be an American meant you were a citizen, you had constitutional rights, you were part of the future, you were free.
Yeah.
But to be a Negro meant you were a subject, you were excluded, you were tied to the past of slavery, you were a servant. Those two identities were structurally and legally opposed.
They cancel each other out.
Exactly. So the black psyche becomes an actual battleground. You are constantly trying to reconcile these two halves that society tells you cannot possibly fit together.
And this brings us to the other massive metaphor in the text, the veil.
The veil. It is the central image of the entire book.
How should we listening at home visualize this veil? Is it like a brick wall?
No, it's a veil. It's semi-transparent, but it distorts absolutely everything that passes through it. It hangs permanently between the black world and the white world.
So if I am a white person looking at a black person, I am looking through the veil.
Right. And because of the fabric of the veil, you do not see the black person clearly. You see the stereotypes. You see your own projected fears. You see the caricature of the Negro. You don't see the complex human being behind it.
And from the other side?
The black person is looking out from behind that veil. They can see the white world, often very clearly, because they have to study it to survive.
That makes sense.
But they also see themselves reflected on the inside of the veil. They see themselves exactly the way the white world sees them. That is the essence of double consciousness.
You are watching yourself perform your own life.
Yes. You are constantly asking, how am I being perceived right this second? Am I being too loud? Am I being threatening? Am I moving too fast?
That sounds completely exhausting. I mean, just cognitively, the amount of daily bandwidth that takes up.
It is incredibly draining. And that actually leads us right into the so what of this discussion. Because this isn't just dusty history. This is about mental health right now, today.
Right. Which brings us to section 3, the psychology of the color line. Because we have a modern source here from Psychology Today that links Du Bois' concept to something called ego dystonia.
Yes, ego dystonia is a clinical psychological state where your thoughts or impulses or actions feel repugnant or wildly inconsistent with your true core self. So if you are constantly performing for a hostile audience, if you are smiling when you desperately want to scream, if you are deliberately making yourself physically small so you don't intimidate a white police officer,
Yeah.
you are engaging in behavior that is entirely dystonic to your ego. You are actively fighting your own truth just to survive the encounter.
That constant friction has to create trauma over time. And there's a story in the research packet that really stopped me cold. It's about an older Black man in a modern hospital setting.
This is such a powerful case study for this concept. The man was admitted for a physical ailment, but he vehemently refused to eat any of the hospital food. He was entirely convinced it was poisoned.
And the doctors did exactly what doctors are trained to do. They diagnosed him based on what they saw.
They diagnosed him with schizophrenia. They said he was suffering from acute paranoia. They looked at him and saw a man who was completely disconnected from reality.
But the article suggests we need to look at this through Du Bois's lens.
Exactly. If you look at this man's life through the lens of history, through the veil, is he actually crazy?
Right.
He grew up in a country that proudly conducted the Tuskegee syphilis study. He grew up in a country with a long documented history of forced sterilizations of minorities.
Yeah.
He grew up in a country where medical neglect of Black bodies is a proven statistical reality.
So his fear isn't a hallucination at all, it's just history.
It is a completely rational survival response to a historically hostile environment.
Yeah.
But because the doctors didn't have that double consciousness because they simply couldn't see the world through his eyes, they pathologized his survival instinct.
They called it madness.
They did. And that is the ongoing tragedy of the veil in the 21st century. Psychology often misreads racial trauma as psychosis.
Wow, that is heavy. But Du Bois and later writers in our sources like Richard Wright didn't paint this entirely as a curse, did they? They hinted that there was actually a gift in this position.
Yes, the gift of second sight.
Which honestly sounds like a superpower, but I imagine it comes with a massive, heavy price tag.
It absolutely does. The core argument is that because Black people have to understand the white world to survive, they develop a level of deep psychological insight that white people, frankly, don't ever need.
Because a white person in a white-dominated society can go their whole entire life without ever really understanding Black culture or Black psychology.
Precisely. They exist in a state of unilateral consciousness.
They only need to know their own world to get by.
Right. But a Black person has to be essentially bilingual, culturally speaking. They have to code switch seamlessly. They have to be able to read the room instantly.
Which creates that cognitive flexibility.
Yes, it creates the second sight. Research suggests this double vision actually creates two self-schemas.
Yeah.
They're often incredibly clairvoyant about the psychology and motives of white people in a way that white people are completely blind to themselves.
So the goal then, the solution, if there is one, isn't necessarily for Black people to lose this second sight.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
The goal is for white people to gain it.
Right.
The goal, according to the texts, is multilateral double consciousness.
Explain that for the listener.
We need a society where the oppressor learns to genuinely see themselves through the eyes of the oppressed, where they can look in the mirror and finally see the veil. Because until that happens, the critical interracial dialogue is always going to be completely one-sided.
That is a profound challenge, and it requires a massive amount of deliberate work. But speaking of work and speaking of seeing things that others completely miss, we really need to make our transition here.
Yes, we are moving from the deeply psychological to the brutally structural.
Because tomorrow is March 1st, Women's History Month. And as we said right at the top of the show, this calendar transition is usually where society just drops the thread. But we are going to pick it up. We are going to talk about the people who exist right in the intersection of these 2 months.
The people who simply cannot choose between being Black and being a woman.
Historically, our sources show there was a massive gap here. You had the civil rights movement on one side,
Which was largely and overtly patriarchal. The formal leadership was almost entirely male. The ministers, the lawyers, the officers.
and the rhetoric was often focused on restoring the manhood of the Negro male right.
Exactly. It was very gendered.
And then on the other side, you had the feminist movement,
Which, especially in the second wave, was heavily dominated by middle-class white women.
and their issues, according to the sources, often felt completely disconnected from Black women.
Very disconnected. They were fighting the feminine mystique, the crushing boredom of the suburban housewife, the fight to just enter the corporate workforce.
But Black women had been in the workforce for centuries.
Exactly. They didn't need the right to work. They were already working themselves to the bone. They needed the right to be paid a fair living wage and not be physically assaulted on the job. So the mainstream feminist movement often felt racist, or at best highly exclusionary to them.
There is a quote here from Frances M. Beale from her 1969 pamphlet called Double Jeopardy that perfectly captures this. She wrote that women are enslaved by our sex within a society where men are not yet free.
Double jeopardy. That was the crucial term before we had the term intersectionality. If Du Bois famously defined double consciousness for black men, Frances Beale is telling us that black women face a triple consciousness: race and gender and class.
And the legal system, the actual machinery of justice in this country, was absolutely not built to handle that kind of complexity. Which brings us to Section 5 and the groundbreaking work of Kimberly Crenshaw.
Kimberly Crenshaw, a brilliant legal scholar who in 1989 officially gave us the word intersectionality.
Now, I know this word gets thrown around on Twitter and the news constantly today, but we really need to go back to the source and what she actually meant, because it is a very specific legal critique.
Yes, it is not just a buzzword. She uses an analogy in her paper that I think is just brilliant: the traffic intersection.
I love this analogy. Let's really break this down for the listener.
Okay, so imagine a literal four-way traffic intersection. Traffic is flowing fast from all four directions. Crenshaw says discrimination is exactly like an accident at that intersection.
Okay, I am picturing it.
If a black woman is standing right in the middle of that intersection and she gets hit, the severe injury could be caused by a car coming down the race road. Or it could be caused by a completely different car coming down the sex road.
Or both cars at the exact same time.
Or both. And if she gets hit by both cars simultaneously, the injury is vastly compounded.
But the law, the way the courts work,
the law insists on asking which specific car hit you.
The law demands a single cause for the accident.
Right. The court looks at the broken body in the intersection and says, well, was it the race car or was it the sex car? You have to pick one to sue for.
And if you say, well, actually, it was the combination of both cars hitting me at once.
The court essentially says, we don't have a legal box for that. So there was no accident, case dismissed.
That is wild. We have to walk through the actual case study she uses in the paper because, honestly, it sounds insane. But this was the literal logic of the United States courts. DeGraff and Reed v. General Motors, 1976.
This case is the absolute smoking gun of intersectional blindness in the law. So here are the basic facts. General Motors had a recession, and they laid off a bunch of workers based strictly on a seniority system.
Last hired, first fitted, standard union practice.
Right. So 5 black women sued GM. They argued that the seniority system perpetuated past discrimination because GM absolutely did not hire black women at all before the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Okay, so because of past racism, all the black women were relatively new hires, which meant when the layoffs came, they were automatically all fired first?
Yes.
Sounds like a crystal clear case of discrimination to me.
You would certainly think so. But here is the defense that General Motors used and the court actually accepted. GM said, look, we don't discriminate against black people. Just look at our factory floor. We have hired black men for years.
Okay.
And then you said, and we don't discriminate against women either. Look at our front office. We have hired white women as secretaries for years.
So the logic is because they hired black men and they separately hired white women, they couldn't possibly be discriminating against black women.
Precisely. The court dismissed the case entirely. They ruled that black women are not a special protected class on their own. They said, and I am paraphrasing the judge's legal opinion here, that the plaintiffs were trying to improperly create a super remedy.
A super remedy? What does that even mean?
The judge argued that if they allowed black women to sue based on the unique combination of race and sex, it would give them greater standing in court than a white woman or a black man.
Because they could claim 2 things instead of 1.
Right. The judge thought it would be unfair to the other single-issue groups.
I mean, hold on. So the literal legal logic is if we acknowledge that you are doubly burdened by society, that somehow gives you an unfair advantage in our courtroom.
That is the twisted logic.
Yes. Yeah.
The court deeply feared opening a Pandora's box. They thought, if we recognize this hybrid category, where does it end? Do we have to recognize everyone's specific intersections?
So they chose to maintain the neat purity of the legal categories, race or sex, rather than address the actual reality of the human women standing bleeding in the intersection.
Exactly.
That is just infuriating. It's like going to a doctor with a broken leg and the flu, and the doctor saying, well, I can treat the leg or I can treat the flu, but if you have both, you are just being greedy. Pick one.
Oh, that is a surprisingly accurate analogy. The law treated whiteness and maleness as the invisible neutral baselines.
Right.
Black men represented standard race discrimination. White women represented standard sex discrimination.
Yeah.
And black women just fell completely into the void between them.
And that wasn't the only case. The sources list Moore v. Hughes helicopter, too.
Yes, in that case, the court categorically refused to let a black woman represent all women in a massive sex discrimination case.
Why?
Because they imply that a black woman's experience of sexism is too distinct or tainted by race to count as standard normal sexism, which implies standard sexism only happens to white women.
And then there was Payne v. Travenol.
Right. Black women sued for race discrimination. But the court told them they couldn't represent black men because their interests might conflict due to sex disparities.
So they are constantly boxed out. Too black to represent women, too female to represent black people.
Exactly. Crenshaw uses another incredibly powerful analogy to explain this structural void. The basement.
Yes. Let's talk about the basement analogy.
Okay, imagine a building with a dark basement. In this basement, all the marginalized people in society are stacked on top of each other.
Stacked based on their disadvantages.
Right. So the people at the very, very bottom, the ones making up the literal floor, are those with multiple overlapping burdens. Race, class, sex, disability.
And above them in the stack.
Above them are people with fewer disadvantages. And at the top of the basement is the ceiling, which is actually the floor for the privileged people living comfortably upstairs.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, there's a hatch in the ceiling to let people out of the basement. But the hatch is extremely narrow. It is only designed for people who can squeeze through by addressing one single issue.
So white women can crawl through the sexism hatch because they don't have the heavy burden of racism holding them down.
Right. And black men can crawl through the racism hatch because they don't have the burden of sexism weighing them down.
But black women?
Black women are metaphorically wider than the hatch. They are multiplied burdened, so they are left stuck in the basement.
Wow.
And here's the real kicker. The people who made it through the hatch, the white feminists and the black male civil rights leaders, they often look down through the hole and say, well, we made it out just fine. Why are you still down there? You must not be trying hard enough.
Completely ignoring the absolute fact that the architecture of the hatch itself is the actual problem.
Exactly. It's not an effort problem. It's a structural design problem. The system was never built to let them out.
This is such heavy stuff. But we definitely don't want to leave the listener down in the basement today. Because the reality of the history is, despite the double consciousness, despite the legal erasure, despite being totally ignored by the courts, black women were organizing anyway.
They were busy building their own staircases out of that basement.
Which brings us to Section 6, the architects.
There's a very famous saying from the historiography of the civil rights movement: men led, but women organized.
I feel like that applies to a lot of things in history, honestly.
It really, really does. You always had the highly charismatic male figures up on the podiums, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy. They held all the formal titles and got the newspaper quotes.
But the bridge leaders, the actual people doing the ground game, connecting the big national organization to the local community, were almost entirely women.
Yes.
We have to start with the great-grandmother of this entire energy, according to the sources, Sojourner Truth.
Ain't I a woman? 1851, Akron, Ohio.
She stands up at a women's rights convention. It is mostly wealthy white women in attendance. And they are talking about voting rights, but there is this heavy underlying Victorian vibe of fragility to the whole event.
The cult of true womanhood. The pervasive idea that a woman is inherently delicate. She needs to be helped into carriages. She needs to be shielded and protected from the harsh realities of the world.
And Sojourner Truth, who was formerly enslaved, who had her own children brutally sold away from her, stands up in this room.
Yes.
She rolls up her sleeve. She shows off this incredibly muscular arm. And she says, I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman?
It gives me chills. She completely shattered their narrow definition. She was essentially saying your definition of woman is entirely based on white upper-class fragility.
Yeah.
My womanhood is forged in brutal labor and survival, and it is just as valid. She was actively demanding that the movement expand its structural definition to include her reality.
So let's flash forward from 1851 to the 20th century, the ideological descendants of Sojourner Truth, the women who did the hard, unglamorous work in the margins.
We absolutely have to talk about Nannie Helen Burroughs.
She founded the National Training School for Women and Girls in 1909.
In Washington, D.C. Now remember, the huge Du Bois versus Washington debate we talked about earlier, higher education versus trades.
Yeah, the either-or debate.
Well, Burroughs refused to choose. She was so pragmatic, she taught women domestic skills, how to be maids, how to cook laundry, because realistically, that was the only paid work actually available to them at the time.
Right. She knew the reality of the market.
But she didn't stop there. Alongside the laundry, she also taught them racial history, public speaking, and union organizing.
That is amazing.
She was essentially training domestic workers to be undercover political revolutionaries.
She famously said in our sources, "We specialize in the wholly impossible."
I love that quote so much. She knew the entire world was stacked against them, so she just specialized in the impossible.
Then there is Dorothy Lee Bolden. This is the story from the packet that I think absolutely everyone listening needs to hear, because this is grassroots organizing at its absolute finest.
Dorothy Lee Bolden. Atlanta, 1968. She was a domestic worker. She'd been doing it cleaning houses since she was 9 years old.
And she decided she wanted to organize a labor union for maids. But how do you even organize maids? They don't work together in a big factory.
Right.
They are completely scattered, isolated in 1,000 different private homes across the city. You can't just stand at the factory gates and hand out flyers to them.
So she looked closely at the logistics of their lives. She asked, how do these women actually get to work every day?
They take the bus?
They take the bus. They all rode the public transit from the black neighborhoods out into the affluent white suburbs. So Bolden simply turned the city bus into the union hall.
That is just brilliant logistical thinking.
She would literally ride the buses back and forth all day, sitting next to exhausted women talking to them. She built the National Domestic Workers Union of America, one single bus ride at a time.
And what did she actually teach them once she got them organized?
She taught them to fiercely recognize their own economic power. One of her biggest initial campaigns was just about car fare.
Bus money.
Yes. She told them, look your employer in the eye and make them pay for your bus ride to their house. Ask for car fare.
It seems like such a tiny, small thing, a few cents.
But it wasn't about the cents. It was about aggressively asserting that their commute was a vital part of the labor. It was about establishing basic human value.
Wow.
And then she registered them to vote en masse. She took thousands of women who were completely invisible inside these private white homes and systematically turned them into a massive voting bloc that the politicians in Atlanta suddenly had to respect in court.
She literally took the women trapped in the basement and organized them into a political force that changed the city.
She absolutely did. And finally, we have to mention Mary McLeod Bethune, the central wheel.
She was the ultimate connector, right?
Yes, she founded the National Council of Negro Women, the NCNW. She served as a high-level advisor to FDR. She fundamentally understood that all these powerful local grassroots groups needed a unified national voice.
So she was the one in the White House, literally in the room, making sure that when the massive New Deal legislation was being written, Black people weren't completely written out of the economic recovery.
Exactly. She was the crucial bridge between the local grassroots organizers like Bolden and the highest levels of the federal government.
It is truly amazing to see the whole historical thread when you lay it out like this. You have Du Bois, way back in 1903, identifying the deep psychological split, the two-ness.
Right.
You have Crenshaw, decades later, identifying the massive legal void of intersectionality. And right there in the middle, you have these incredible women, Burroughs, Bolden, Bethune, who just looked at that void and filled it with relentless action.
They didn't wait around for the academic theory to catch up to their lives. They just did the necessary work to survive.
They lived the intersectionality long before it had a name. They didn't have the luxury of separating their Blackness from their womanhood.
No, they had to save the whole entire community just to save themselves.
So as we start to wrap up this flagship episode, we have covered a truly massive amount of ground today.
We really have, from the early Reconstruction era right up to the modern psychiatric hospital room.
From the rigid halls of the Supreme Court down to the sweaty seats of the Atlanta City bus.
We have moved from the philosophical concept of the veil to the brutal structural reality of the basement.
And I think it is really important to reflect on the actual date again as we close, February 28th.
The transition point.
We are standing right on the edge of the calendar. But as we have seen so clearly today, these histories are not isolated silos. You simply cannot fully understand Black history without understanding the massive role of women.
And you cannot understand women's history without deeply understanding the role of race.
They are intricately, permanently woven together. And the actual people who lived them, people like Dorothy Lee Bolden, they are the thread that binds it all together.
Beautifully said.
So here is our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Du Bois wondered constantly if the veil could ever truly be lifted. And Crenshaw asks us today if we can fundamentally rebuild the basement.
And the challenge for you out there listening is this. If double consciousness is the sensation of always looking at yourself through the eyes of others,
consider this. Whose eyes are you looking through when you view the world around you?
are you actively practicing that multilateral consciousness we talked about? Are you genuinely trying to see the world through the complex lens of the person standing right in the middle of that dangerous intersection?
Or are you just comfortably staring at the veil?
Bois famously said the problem of the 20th century was the color line.
I think the problem of the 21st century might just be our stubborn refusal to see the intersections.
That is absolutely something to sit with this weekend.
It really is. Jesse down in Puerto Rico and all our dedicated learners out there, keep building those bridges. We will see you in March. The J Spot is a J. Breyer Allen production, edited by Jay Rivera, Danielle Reyes, and Gisette Garcia.